Please confirm. Eternal destruction. Quick. Thank you. Restart. 3, 2, 1, go. Come on. Yeah.
There are a few names that are etched into the history of emulation. There's MAME, the arcade emulator that helped preserve masses of unique arcade titles. There's Ultra HLE, the Nintendo 64 emulator that came out of nowhere around the console's launch to help emulate the most popular titles of the Nintendo 64 on modest PC hardware. And then there's Bleem, which was a PlayStation emulator that ended up being released commercially, somewhat briefly. It actually would have got away with it too, if it were not for the endless coffers of Sony's legal department. Today we're going to talk about the various versions of Bleem and the way that their battle with Sony in the courts unfolded. An emulator, in this context, is essentially a piece of software that allows games to run on hardware that they were not designed for. Bleem was a PlayStation emulator for Windows, which meant that it allowed people to put their PlayStation games in their computer's CD-ROM drive and play them on their computer. The emulator itself was a bit of a coding marvel, having been written entirely in assembler language and making full use of the 3D accelerators available for the PC. This meant that the games could actually look significantly better on the PC through Bleem than when they were played natively on the PlayStation console. Sure, there were lots of bugs, but the majority of popular titles were very playable. The developers spent a long time analysing the PlayStation hardware and reverse engineering it for the emulator, ensuring that they did not cross any lines legally. The emulator was released in March 1999, when the PlayStation was at the height of its popularity. Users would purchase the Bleem CD commercially, which essentially functioned as a form of copy protection for the emulation software. After that, all updates would be freely downloadable from the net. This set alarm bells ringing at Sony, because the small group of people behind Bleem stood to make a good deal of money from the emulator. There were many people out there who would choose to pay a comparatively small amount of money for Bleem, rather than shell out a lot of money for the PlayStation hardware itself, especially if they'd already spent a lot on a good PC. Despite all the precautions taken by the developers, Sony filed suit against Bleem only 2 days after they started accepting pre-orders. In spite of the ongoing court case against them, the developers of Bleem continued to push and improve their emulator. Magazines carried ads for Bleem, and reviewers praised the software for its compatibility and graphical trickery. The developers even created a special version of Bleem for the Dreamcast, cleverly titled Bleemcast. Initially, this release was meant to function like the computer version, with the emulator supporting the majority of the PlayStation's library. However, financial and technical issues changed this plan, and Bleemcast was instead released in packs for individual games. Due to the legal battle, only 3 of these were actually released: Metal Gear Solid, Tekken 3, and Gran Turismo 2. Even though Bleemcast did not end up where the developer had imagined, it was still a huge technical achievement, and yet another interesting piece of history associated with their company. Sony's legal attacks against Bleem did not go quite as they had planned. Since the developers of Bleem had developed the emulator by reverse engineering Sony's console, they were completely in the right legally for selling Bleem as their own work. For a short time, it seemed as though their forethought and planning when programming Bleem had been successful. In a last-ditch attempt to swing the legal battle their way, Sony went after the advertising materials Bleem had been using, citing their comparison photos as being in breach of copyright and an illegal use of Sony assets. A preliminary injunction against Bleem was initially granted by the district courts, but the Supreme Court finally agreed that the use of screenshots within the advertising fell under fair use. Sony had completely failed in all of their attempts to halt the emulator in the courts. Or so it seemed. Sadly, Sony had managed to bully the Bleem company into submission financially, with the legal costs simply adding up to more than the company could afford. In spite of their successful courtroom debates and the court's attempt to protect David from Goliath, Bleem was discontinued and the company shut down. The final stable release of the emulator came on August 16, 2001, when Bleem faded from the marketplace. However, the impact of the emulator lives on. Their public success against Sony in the courtroom reignited the emulation community online, with both updates for old emulators and brand new emulators springing to life soon after. With the muddy legal waters cleared regarding emulation, programmers knew that if they followed Bleem's lead, they would never have to worry about treading illegally. Sony even recognised the talents of the Bleem team by poaching some of their old staff members. Sean Corpine spent time promoting games for Sony Online Entertainment, while Randy Linden was brought on for a time to assist with porting titles and enabling backwards compatibility for older PlayStation titles on the new consoles. Bleem was kind of like the James Dean of emulators. It had a short but exciting life, and it helped to influence and change the culture around it forever. So next time you're playing an HD re-release of your favourite title or downloading a public domain ROM for Kega, spare a thought for Bleem. If you've enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like it, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and follow us on Twitter. See you for the next episode.